Okay, so welcome to our first Lomdeha community Mishlei shiur. I'm very excited. This is actually going to be an atypical shiur because this is introductory. You'll see as soon as we start, hopefully after the after Sukkot, then we're going to just dive right in, and every shiur is just going to be Mishlei as much as we can. But I figured we would start off with an introduction. Now, I noticed that there's in the group here, then there are some of you who have learned Mishlei with me as chavrusas, some of you who have been at various Mishlei shiurim with me, and then some of you who I taught in high school. So some of this might be review for you, but review is always a good thing. So let's start off, and please interrupt with questions and like comments and insights. This can, I basically structure this as like a bare bones introduction to Mishlei, but your questions can cause this to take different directions. So feel free to just interrupt me because I can't see when your hands are raised or whatever. All right, so basic information. Title of the book, Sefer Mishlei. How do you translate Mishlei? And there are three answers I know of. This is going to be a participatory thing, if you hadn't realized, because it's me.
Proverbs.
Proverbs, okay, right. So the most common translation is Proverbs. And what would you have, what's the working definition of proverb?
Like a saying?
Yeah, a saying. What kind of saying usually?
With some instruction as part of it?
Yeah, right. Usually it's an instructive saying, usually practical, right? Has some bearing on practical life, either everyday life or a proverb within like a certain area. I'll comment really quickly. I mean, I'm going to kind of try to pepper this with certain Mishlei methodology points. So Shlomo's proverbs are different than most proverbs, or I shouldn't say most proverbs, they're different than American proverbs, because the style of an American proverb is to convey a readily understandable lesson in a very pithy, effective way, right? So the early bird catches the worm. Two wrongs don't make a right, and the goal really is not to promote thought. The goal is to convey the idea, right? Shlomo's proverbs are different, okay? Shlomo's proverbs are designed, first of all, they are multifaceted. Each one contains many different possible interpretations and ideas, but I like to think of them more as puzzles, okay? So they're short and they have the form of a proverb, and some of them are even quotable, but they're definitely not designed for efficient communication of spoon feeding ideas. Okay, so that's one difference between the normal proverb and this. But they are designed as proverbs. They're designed to be something that you can remember and quote. Okay, so that's one translation. How else do you translate mushel?
Parable.
Parable, right? So what is a parable?
It's like a story usually containing, I think, animals technically.
Yeah, right.
To tell over a moral lesson.
Yeah, right. So so a short little story with a little lesson attached to it. Okay, good. And then what's the third translation? I forgot what order I put it in. That's why I'm not showing it yet. And this kind of overlaps because, I mean, let's say, for example, the boy who cried wolf would be a parable, right? But sometimes we use parable in a different way, or we translate mushel in a different way.
Metaphor?
Metaphor. Okay, right. So you okay, good. That's what I thought I had. So you got the book of Proverbs, you have the book of metaphors or analogies, and then the book of examples or parables. Okay, and I think he chose this title deliberately because if you look through Mishlei, it has all three in it, right? So you've got the general form of it is Proverbs, although not all of it. Some of it is paragraphs. There are lots of psukim with analogies, and there are some elaborate analogies like the Eshes Chayil or the Isha Nachriya. And then there are lots of parables, either, again, full-length parables of, describing, what happens to a certain particular youth, or like, condensed parables in the form of one pasuk where you kind of have to extrapolate like the events, okay? So that's the title of Mishlei, okay? And we're going to see that there's a fourth title later on, but not from Shlomo. Okay, author was Shlomo HaMelech. It seems to be pretty unanimous that he came up with the material. We'll see in a second that not all of the parts of the book were necessarily written by him, but Shlomo is definitely he has the reputation of the wisest of men, either in his time or period. I guess depends on how you define that. But the wisdom that he was known for, if you go through the psukim, we're not talking like theoretical wisdom. Obviously Moshe Rabbeinu knew the most out of everyone. It was wisdom with the ability that gave him the ability to govern and to be a king, right? So with a practical dimension to it. Mishlei has 5 sections, okay? Chapters 1 through 9 is the introduction. Chapters 10 through 24 is Mishlei Shlomo written by Shlomo HaMelech. 25 through 29 is Mishlei Shlomo written by the Anshe Chizkiyahu, the men of Chizkiyahu's court, which was much later. I don't remember offhand how many years later. These we know are 3 sections because they're introduced in the text with the words Mishlei Shlomo. So like that's acknowledged in the book itself. Okay. Then section 4 is the hardest to define. Okay, it's Divrei Agur ben Yake and Divrei Lemuel. Okay, it's this weird in between thing. The psukim are very strange in their form. It's unclear who's talking. And then you end with the last 21 psukim, which is Eishes Chayil. It's the conclusion of Mishlei. Audience of Mishlei? Yes. Yeah,
the Mishlei Shlomo were written by the Anshe Chizkiyahu. Those were things that are attributed to Shlomo, just not written down by him?
Yeah, so the word that it uses is tiku with an ayin taf kuf, which I think literally means copied down or transcribed. And my understanding of it is that the content is from Shlomo, but they formulated the Proverbs. And that's kind of my own theory, because if you look at all the Proverbs from chapter 10 through 24, they have a certain style. And then and I'm not talking sophisticated like observation of style, but if you just look at 25 through 29, it's just straight up mushal. Like snow in the winter and like rain in the harvest season, so is one who gives honor to a fool. Or like a dog returning to its own vomit, so too is a fool who repeats his foolishness. It's just much more straightforward than the very cryptic psukim of the earlier ones. So that's why I think it wasn't written by Shlomo. The ideas were from Shlomo, but then Anshe Chizkiyahu formulated it in a different way than Shlomo did.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, who is the audience of Mishlei? So there are a variety of audiences, and the audiences are defined by their developmental level or their perfection, if you want to call it that. And the purpose of Mishlei differs according to the different audiences. Okay, there are some general purposes that he states, and then some that are audience specific. So I want to read through the first 6 psukim, and we're not going to dwell on them. This is just to show you what his stated goals are, and then who the book is for. Okay, so Mishlei Shlomo ben David Melech Yisrael. These are the mashalim deliberately untranslated of Shlomo, son of David, king of Yisrael, king of Israel. So now he states his primary objectives: Ladas chachma u'musar, to know wisdom and musar. Musar is either discipline or rebuke. Lahavin imre bina, to understand statements of understanding or words of understanding. Lakachas musar haskell, to take intelligent discipline and rebuke. Tzedek u'mishpat u'mesharim, righteousness, justice, and uprightness. Okay, and we're not going to define those quite yet. Okay, I'm gonna explain why I think you shouldn't define them quite yet. Okay, let's just go on. Next 3 psukim of the intro. Laseis lepisaim orma, to give naive simpletons cunning or cleverness. Lena'ar, to a youth, da'as umazima, knowledge and counsel. And these are just conventional translations. Okay, we can debate what the exact translation should be. Yishma chacham yosef lekach, a wise person will hear and increase his learning. V'navon tachbulos yekna, and an understanding person will acquire strategies. So I put these in green to show that these seem to correspond to the specific audiences. So the Pesi, this naive simpleton, he needs cunning. The youth needs knowledge and counsel. The Chacham gets increase of learning, and the Navon gets strategies. And then I think we go back to general objectives for everyone. Lahavin mashal u'melita, to understand proverb and allegory. Divrei chachamim v'chidosam, the words of the wise and their riddles, which most Mefarshim will say that these are 4 different categories of allegory: mashal, melita, divrei chachamim, and chida. Okay, so this is the introduction to Mishlei, and if you were to approach this in a normal way, you would assume that what we should do is we should try to figure out what all these psukim mean, right? And what all these terms mean, and what all these definitions of people mean. What is chachma? What is musar? What does it mean to understand statements of understanding? What is righteousness, justice, and uprightness? I have tried on several occasions to start a Mishlei class like that. But here's the problem. The problem is, if you look at the Mefarshim, they all have almost completely different definitions for all these terms. Okay, and they're very emphatic about it. Okay, like they will say that, they'll define each term precisely, that tzedek means this, and it's mutually exclusive to mishpat, which means that, and it's different than mesharim. And, you could sit there and try to figure it out on your own, or you can look at the Mefarshim, but then you're just going to get lost. If you try to figure it out on your own, then it's almost just wild speculation, or it's association, not based on how Shlomo uses the term, but based on like your own associations to how these terms are floating around. And if you use the Mefarshim, so you kind of have to commit to one approach in order to see a consistent scheme. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's a little bit of a stifling way to learn the book, which is why I have a Masorah from my Mishlei Rabbi Moskowitz, which is to skip the intro to Mishlei, skip the first 9 chapters, and just start learning Mishlei. And when I tell people about this, like right now in yeshiva, Rabbi Zimmer is giving a shiur on the first 9 chapters of Mishlei, and he's going from the very beginning. When I first told him about this a couple years ago, he was like, "How can you just skip the intro?" And Rabbi Moskowitz's reasoning is that that the idea of Shlomo stating these terms is he's not expecting you to understand what these terms are from his words. There's no way you can derive what Chachma means from this one statement. But as you go through the book, you start to form your own definitions of these terms, and that's part of the process. And like the way I think of it is, any student in Mishlei should have either mentally or in writing, a working glossary of Mishleic terms that you're constantly tweaking and constantly building upon. And what he does by showing you, these terms in the beginning is he shows you what the key terms are and what the goals are and who they're for, but he kind of leaves it up to you to figure it out as you go. And I think that's why the different Mefarshim have completely different sets of terms, because they all understood these terms, in accordance with their own unique approach to the book. And I think in Mishlei, there's a lot of room for personal, for your own personal interpretation and your own approach to the book. So that's my theory, and that's why we're skipping not only these introductory psukim, but we're actually skipping the first 9 chapters, again, because there's another shiur in yeshiva about that, but also I find that the best way to learn this is to just dive into Mishlei and start learning it, and then you start to pick up on his lingo and interpret it on your own. So any questions on that? That's my take on the intro. And in case you're scared of is he going to leave us with no guidance whatsoever? Are we going to be totally lost? I will leave you with an interpretation of puzzle number 2, okay, at the very end, which you can use as like a starter puzzle, a starter set of definitions, okay. But I think it's actually it would be harmful for our learning if I told you my working definitions, because then you get into this pattern where you just start plugging in definitions and then you don't actually learn the psukim. You just plug in the terms and then just take the first idea that comes to your mind, and that's not real learning. We gotta delve into psukim on our own. Okay, shall we move on? Okay, so again, feel free to interrupt me with any questions. All right, so I just to mention the scope of this shiur after Sukkot is we're gonna primarily focus on chapters 10 through 29. Okay, if you want a shiur on chapter 1 through 9, go to Rabbi Zimmer shiur. We might do Eishes Chayil at the end. I once gave a shiur on Eishes Chayil in yeshiva, and there have been requests to complete it because I never completed it. So maybe we'll do that later on in the year. We'll see what people want to do. Okay, so what we're going to focus on today is the introduction written by Saadia Gaon to Mishlei. Now, Saadia Gaon, I believe, must have been one of the first commentaries on Mishlei, because he's one of the earliest commentators, period, who wrote full commentaries on Tanakh. His commentary to Mishlei was written in Arabic and then translated into Hebrew by Kafif. So what we're going to see here is we've got Kafif's Hebrew translation on the right, and then my English translation on the left. And if you want a copy of this, it's very hard to get a hold of as Hebrew text, but I have a PDF, which I would attempt to upload. That's going to be ugly. So if you want it, email me and I'll send you the Hebrew PDF. This approach is the closest to my Mishlei Rebbe's approach. Rabbi Moskowitz, I don't actually know if he got it from Saadia Gaon. I kind of doubt that, because I just can't imagine he had a copy of Saadia Gaon when he started learning Mishlei. But it expresses, this Hakdama basically expresses all of the premises that I have in learning Mishlei, and what our method is going to be in terms of what we're looking for. So I figured this would be a good introductory thing, and then that's our agenda for today. Okay, as the introduction of Saadia Gaon. We're not even doing the whole thing. We're just doing the first part. Okay, so he starts off with, I mentioned there's another title to Mishlei, okay? And I guess this was a quirk or a practice of Saadia Gaon. He gives nicknames to all the books of Tanakh, okay? And he calls Mishlei Sefer Drishas HaChachma. How do you translate that?
Wise derivations?
Yeah, so derivation, so you're thinking of the rabbinic usage of doresh, which is to like darshan, right? To like, interpret. But in Hebrew, in biblical Hebrew, it means to seek or to pursue, right? Kind of to seek and pursue. So in English, I call it the Book of the Pursuit of Wisdom, okay? Which is a very epic title. And he doesn't, I think by the end, you'll see what he means by why we call this the Book of Pursuit of Wisdom. Okay, if I forget, remind me to come back to this. Try to remind me to come back to this. So the style of I don't know all the Rishonim and Gaonim, but certainly the ones in the Sephardic lands typically would start off each of their commentaries with a praise of God. Okay, so he starts off his praise here. This is the third person intro. The author prefaces his commentary first and said, Baruch Hashem Elkei Yisrael, blessed is Hashem, God of Israel, Hayachid be'emes, the truly unique one, Ha'echad, the oneness, or the one, Hakadmon b'muvan haroshios, first in the sense of prior, okay? Without going into too much of a tangent, what would be the problem of calling God the first one? If you didn't qualify, you just said God is the Kadmon, the early one, or the first one?
Implies the second one.
It implies, it implies the second one,
like he's
right?
the first of many.
Right, first of many. What about though in terms of like because Kodim can mean first or can mean early, right? So I think he means early.
Yeah, I was going to say the problem with saying early is that implies that his existence is early on within the framework of time.
Exactly, it implies that he's in time, right? So this is a very Saadia Gaon type thing. Is he immediately qualifies it Hakadmun b'muvan haroshios, roshio. I don't know if it's roshios or roshius, but he means prior, meaning not chronologically prior, but existentially prior or conceptually prior. Like I'd say, for example, this is a bad example. Okay, it's bad because it doesn't quite apply here. But let's say if you say if you're talking about meal courses, so you have appetizer, dinner, and dessert. Okay, so appetizer is chronologically prior to dinner, but logically, dinner is prior to appetizer because you don't have an appetizer without dinner. Dinner, the concept of dinner has to exist in order for there to be an appetizer because the whole point of appetizer is to make you hungry for dinner, So not an exact analogy here, but the idea is that God is prior in concept and in the nature of his existence to everything, but not in time. That's just why Saadia Gaon throws that in. Okay. So then he segues now into his proper intro to Mishlei, not just general praises of God. Asher chachmasu hi shehu yodea hakol, whose wisdom is that he knows all. V'inyan yichalto hi shehu yachol al kol davar, and his ability is that he is omnipotent over everything. Hachafetz lanu es hatov ha'osher, he desires for us the good and the happiness, the true happiness. V'rosham umachtechem hi hayedia, and the beginning and the key to which is knowledge. Okay, so this is both a praise of God, but it's also setting up the subject of the book in a certain way, right? So he calls it the book of seeking Chachma, and right now let's treat Chachma and knowledge as synonyms, right? So what is he saying we're going to get out of this? Out of the Chachma in the book?
Happiness.
Happiness, right? Happiness and goodness, okay? And he's calling knowledge the key to happiness and goodness, okay? He's not specifying how that's going to bring us happiness yet, but he's saying that knowledge is the key. I'm remembering now, I believe that the Kuzari, in his explanation of Shemona Esrei, says that this is why the Atachone comes first in the request, because it really is the key to all of the other, to unlocking the goods of everything else. Like if you have health, or if you have like money, but you don't have wisdom, then you aren't able to use it properly, So really, in a certain way, like you need Chachma to access all of the other goods, but he might mean something more primary. Okay, so this is his little intro praise, but now let's delve into his actual intro. And I'm not going to read the whole thing in Hebrew. I just wanted to read this because of the eloquence of the praise. Okay, after the preface, man's only superiority over the other animals is his rational faculty, just as the only superiority of animals over plants is their ability to move, and just as the only Yeah, and just as the only superiority of plants over, sorry, I just misread that. Just as the only superiority of animals over plants is their ability to move, and just as the only superiority of plants over other entities is their ability to grow. So this was a very Aristotelian notion here of like, you have the hierarchy of like mineral, plant, animal, and human. So like mineral is like inorganic matter, plant is organic, but can't move. Animal is like an organism that has its own, animation, its own ability to move, and then human beings are animal plus rationality. Okay. Even though this principle is clear to all who have contemplated, it was nevertheless stated in the Holy Writings, as the prophet said, "Who makes us more knowing than the beasts of the land, and makes us wiser than the birds of the sky?" The explanation of this is as follows. God teaches us in a uniquely superior way, above that of animals, and he makes us wiser than the birds. Okay. So basic premise here, the thing that differentiates human beings from animals is our Tzelem Elohim, is our intellect, our rational faculty. He calls it in the Hebrew Hayadiah. Okay. I don't know the Arabic to be able to say like what that exactly that corresponds to, but knowledge. Okay, so this is a basic premise here. I don't think there's much to say here. Since man shares a common denominator with the animals in his instinctual nature, okay, and just to point out the Hebrew here, so he's using the word teva here as instinctual nature, not just nature. So since man has instinctual nature in common with the animals and behavioral tendencies, but is nobler in his knowledge and discernment, it is therefore necessary for his essential defining quality to govern the lower element within him. In other words, his intellect should govern his instinctual nature, since his intellect is higher and his instinctual nature is lower. If man acts righteously by causing his intellect to rule over his instinctual nature, then his uniquely human qualities will be manifest. But if man acts unjustly by allowing his instincts to rule over his intellect, his behavior will be like that of the animals. So he's making an argument here for why you should live life based on your intellect. And I think there are many arguments you can make, but what would you say his argument is? I call it, it's a strange argument because it's not the type of argument that we make, but I think it was a very like familiar type of argument in that style of philosophy.
That if he acts as such by, ruling over his instincts with his intellect, he will allow his uniquely human qualities to prevail. Like
okay,
to,
so I'm
to
just
be
going to push one
manifest.
step further. So who cares? Like, why should he do that? And I'm not saying he necessarily answers it. I'm saying like I think we have to like fill in the
Yeah, I'm saying, yeah, okay, fine. Yeah, I was like looking for it in his words. I don't think it's necessarily clear from here.
So you can accomplish your goals?
Presumably I was going to say to achieve the happiness that he referred to earlier.
So those are definitely two possibilities, right? To achieve your goals, that's not in the text. And then to achieve your the happiness you mentioned earlier, that is in the text. But if we took his words at face value and just tried to extrapolate the most minimal interpretation here, what is he saying is going to be like wrong or bad if we don't live according to our intellect?
It's like something lower ruling over something higher.
Yeah, so he puts a lot of this emphasis on something lower ruling over something higher, and somehow that's bad. But can we like explain like why, in what sense that's bad?
I have a question. How do you derive exactly that he is holding that the intellect is the higher?
So he calls it the higher. Just to read it in Hebrew here, he says, "Nischayev shete hahagdara hana'ale shebahagdarosa," which literally means the superior defining element of his defining elements. Manhiga should conduct or guide as hashafel shebehen, the lower part, and then he explains himself. Kolomar, meaning to say, shihe haseichel manhig es hateva, that the intellect should govern the instinctual nature. Shehaseichel hu hanale, because the intellect is the higher, the hateva hu hashafel, and the instinctual is the lower. So he seems to definitely be holding that.
Oh, I was wondering, is he giving you a proof, any type of proof, or is he just holding? I mean, obviously, I don't dispute, but I was just
so in that last portion that we read here, he says even though this principle is clear to all who contemplate it, it was nevertheless stated in the Holy Writings. So he does seem to take it for granted that it's obvious to any person that the advantage that we have over the animals is our intellect. But then he says he backs it up with Tanakh also, and I guess he quotes this pasuk because it explicitly says, what pasuk would you expect him to quote when talking about the thing that makes man unique?
Tselem Elokim.
Right? Nase Adam b'Tselem Elokim Nusenu, right? I think he quotes this pasuk in Eov because it explicitly compares us to the animals, in terms of wisdom. So I think he is. I think that was Naomi speaking. I think he does. What do you call it? He does take us for granted that we accept his premises, and then now he's just trying to make another argument here as to like why this should be, that why we should govern our lower self based on the higher self.
But it's funny. It sounds like he's saying because it's unique to man, because
Yeah.
that's the difference. But from that same argument, would you say like a bird needs to fly because
Yeah.
of its abilities, but then it's like the bird flying is not any superior to the monkey jumping,
Okay, right.
or whatever.
Okay, so that's actually a really good point. Okay, because I'll tell you. So I'll tell you my understanding of this, and I think that point gives a greater nuance, which is, I think his premise here. He started off by saying God gave us something unique that makes us different than the animals. So I think it stands to reason. Oh, and not only that, but it is higher. Now, again, where he gets that from, he seems to be saying it's obvious, but he seems to be saying that the fact that God gave us something unique that defines us and differentiates us from the animals, so then that's clearly for a reason. And if we don't live in accordance with that unique thing, so then we're just living like the animals. And then, like, what's the point of us having this faculty? In other words, he's basically saying that I mean, so let me actually compare it to your bird example here, right? A bird has wings, okay? And remember that he's working in a what do you call it? A time before evolution, right? So like there's so the question of like I guess flightless birds or like vestigial organs didn't bother them as much, right? But like if you have a bird that has wings and it doesn't use its wings, then what's the point of it having wings? So a human being has a mind. If you're not using your mind, what's the point of it? And especially if it is so clearly higher than the rest of you, which he's going to make an argument for later on. So it's like a I mean, I don't know if you call it a teleological argument, but it's like a design-based argument. Like if you have a feature of something that is designed and it clearly like differentiates itself through that feature from everything else, it's supposed to use that thing. And if that thing is higher, so then certainly it should use it. And again, he's going to explain in a little while why it's higher or why it's superior. Okay? I'll take that silence as okay. All right, let's go on. All right, even though the correct idea of this idea is evident to anyone who contemplates it. Okay, so again, he's emphasizing this is an obvious thing, right? Hashem, may he be exalted and glorified, chose to include it in his book. I will educate you and enlighten you in this path on which you go. Be not like a horse, like a mule which lacks understanding. That's from Tehillim. The explanation of these two psukim is as follows: I will educate you and enlighten you in this path on which you go, and I will advise you with my providence, my hashgacha. Therefore, be not like the animals which have no understanding and who require a bit and a bridle to restrain them, so that they do not approach you to cause harm. Okay. So now he introduces another note here. Okay, so one thing that the intellect does is it differentiates us from the animals, and it should guide our instinctual nature. But then he gives a specific role as to what function the intellect should provide that we have via our intellect, but the animals have via a bit and a bridle, or what do you call it? Bit and a bridle. So what function is he highlighting the intellect right now?
Restraint.
Restraint, okay? So restraint, all right? And we'll see what type of restraint he means, all right? So now he says like this, okay? Now that he starts going into his psychological premises. All of man's initial impulses, in the Hebrew here is ha'ole alev kol bnei adam tchila mi'inyanehem. So the thing that arises first in your heart originate in his instinctual nature, since it is antecedent in his physical constitution and psychological makeup. So in other words, you like Chazal say, right? Your Yetzer Hatov, your Yetzer Hara got a 13-year head start on your Yetzer Hatov. You were born just a raw bundle of animal instincts, and your intellect slowly came online, more or less like around your bar mitzvah. So your instincts have been with you for a very, very long time. Okay, that's why Shlomo in Koheles calls the intellect the young whippersnapper. I mean, he doesn't use that phrase, but the young chacham, and he calls the Yetzer Hara the old king, because it predates the Yetzer Tov. Okay, so the first thing that comes up, your initial impulses are all from your animalistic nature. Therefore, when something of this nature enters your heart, do not give any thought to practical implementation, and certainly do not act upon it until after you have presented it before your intellect. If your intellect necessitates the action, do it. If your intellect necessitates abandoning it, abandon it. Concerning this, in the pasuk said, "I instruct you in the way of wisdom, I lead you in the course of uprightness." Okay, so this is what do you call it? This is giving us a clarification of what he meant by restraint. Okay, so what role is the intellect playing here? Like how is it restraining? What's its job function? Its job description?
It's judging which actions to do.
Yeah, judging which actions to do, right? So you got this impulse, okay? It's essentially impulse control. You got this impulse. The impulse comes from your animalistic nature, so you shouldn't trust it. Your intellect can then judge, is this something I should do or not? Okay. Okay, we're good? Okay, onward. Similarly, this is now just the flip side. If your intellect necessitates a specific action, but your instinctual nature loathes that action and resists it, then it is proper to do the action without paying any attention to your instinctual unwillingness. And similarly, if your intellect cautions you to refrain from a specific action, but your instinctual nature inclines you toward that action and craves it, it is proper to abandon it without paying any attention to your instinctual desire. So you really could think of this as like a parent of a baby or a pet owner of an animal, or maybe they're the same. I don't know. That the animal or the baby doesn't know what's good for it. It's just acting on raw instinct. If it sees something shiny, it'll put it in its mouth, And the role of the intellect is to both restrain it from doing things that are impulsive and harmful, and also to compel it to do things that it wouldn't do on its own because that would be good for it. Okay, so that's the role that the intellect is being cast in here. Again, purely practical, right? We're not talking about the intellect as seeking knowledge for its own sake. That plays no role here right now. Okay, this parallel, now he gives an analogy, not like mine with the baby and the pet owner, back. Okay, this parallels the conduct of a righteous judge who strives for that which is in line with the truth, though it may be undesirable to the litigants, and who pushes away that which opposes the truth, though it may be desirable to the litigants. This concept was already stated. Then you will understand righteousness and justice and fairness and in every good course. So be like a judge, right? You're a judge, and you've got the two guys in front of you, and they're yelling at you and they're yelling at each other, and this one wants to sue this guy and this one wants to like win against this guy. You can't let their emotional appeals affect your judgment. You have to do what is in line with the truth and ignore them, or not let them sway you. I mean, I shouldn't say ignore them because you got to listen to them, but not let them make decisions for you. Okay. Then he says a fundamental principle. It is correct for man to rejoice in that which is desirable to his intellect, even though his instinctual nature abhors it, and it is proper for him to distance himself from that which his intellect rejects, even though his instinctual nature desires it. Concerning this, it was stated, enactment of justice is a joy to the righteous and destruction to the doers of iniquity. Okay, so your sense of attraction and repulsion, to use Aristotelian terms, should be governed by your intellect, and this should actually, you should actually start to cultivate a joy and an abhorrence based on the dictates of your intellect, not based on the dictates of your emotions. Okay, and he's going to talk about how that happens, because right now it sounds a little, I don't know if anyone's bothered by this, it's sounding a little artificial, like it's, he's making this very, very clean distinction between the intellect and the emotions, the instincts, and like we don't quite work that way in practice, but we'll get to that later on. Okay, so then he now drops the Freud bomb, okay? And see, those of you who have read Freud, tell me what principle this is, okay? The fundamental principle on which all these matters hinge may be stated as follows. Man's instinctual nature lusts after every immediate pleasure without paying any attention to whether the consequences are harmful, whereas the intellect recoils from immediate gratification if it knows that in this it will bring pain in the future. right? So in other words, your animalistic part wants immediate pleasure, doesn't care about consequences. Your intellect doesn't want immediate pleasure if it knows that there are going to be harmful consequences. Likewise, man's instinctual nature recoils from immediate pain, even though contentment and gratification will follow in its footsteps, whereas the intellect will choose to endure exertion and immediate pain if it clearly knows that something good and beneficial will follow in its footsteps. Anyone know what I'm talking about Freud-wise? I mean, I know he went through various iterations of this, but this is the pleasure principle, or the pleasure pain principle, right? Is that the two fundamental, the fundamental drive here is just a drive towards immediate pleasure without caring about what's going to happen, and an avoidance of immediate pain. Okay, and that's how the instincts are programmed, and the intellect is really the opposite. It's looking towards the long term. So your animalistic instincts are involved with the short term, and ignore the long term. Your intellect is looking long term. These two principles can be applied to an infinite number of particulars, but I will only mention a few examples within each category. So there are clearly many examples of the types of emotions that we feel, the types of situations where it comes up, but it all boils down to this one principle. And this is his psychological premise. Any questions or disagreements with this? I mean, I think it's experientially true. Okay, onward. The instinctual part of man. Yes.
Take me a second to unmute. Are you making any distinction here? I mean, there's the pleasure pain principle in terms of the instincts, but then the intellect seems to have its own pleasure pain guidance that's not necessarily in line with that.
Okay, so you mean according to Freud or according to Saadia Gaon?
Saadia Gaon. Yeah,
according to Saadia Gaon, right? So the way I understand him to mean here is that, yeah, that's a good point. So let me clarify what I meant. The person as a whole wants pleasure and wants to avoid pain, but the animalistic part of you is only focused on the short term and can't see the long term, and the intellect wants what is in the long term. But right now it seems to be that and you'll see this from his examples, that that the intellect is trying to get you the same type of pleasure that the animalistic part of you wants. It's just the intellect is better at doing it. And same thing with the pain. So we're not talking, for example, about like intellectual pleasure or intellectual pain. We're talking about psychological or physical pleasure and pain. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and that ultimately, given that the intellect is the higher part of the person, that will hopefully guide the person for a better payoff in terms of pleasure and pain.
Yes, right. And that's the interesting thing, by the way, is that even though he went through this whole, presentation about how the intellect is the higher part of man, he has not yet talked about what truly defines us as human, which has nothing to do with pleasure and pain, which is seeking knowledge for its own sake. Okay, that does not show up in his in this first part of his introduction. So he's not negating it, but he's not making that the primary focus right now. Right now, the intellect is being portrayed as a tool for obtaining pleasure and avoiding pain. And that is an exercise. He's saying that is an exercise of your higher element, meaning that partakes of. He's calling that human behavior, human living, because you're doing more than what the animal does.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so now he defines the two primary drives, okay? And the first one is, so he calls it, I'll just preface this, he's going to call this a taiva, atzlus and taiva, laziness and taiva. I'm smiling because if you ask any of my my former Shalhevet students what the definition of laziness is, they'll spit it out, because I drilled this into them in the study skills class. He says, the instinctual part of man recoils from everything that causes him immediate exertion and pain. This is due to a vice called atzlus, laziness. Now, I would love to dwell on this because it's such a radical definition of laziness. I'm sure we'll have our fill of laziness later on, but just take a moment to appreciate this, right? So laziness, I think if you ask the average person what laziness means, they would say it either is like lack of motivation, lack of energy, lack of willpower, some sort of deficiency, Shlomo HaMelech defines laziness as a type of foolishness. And according to Saadia Gaon, laziness is the compulsive need to avoid all immediate pain and conflict, or exertion and pain. Okay, so it's a very different thing, if you think about it like in terms of the solutions for laziness, if laziness is a lack of motivation, so what's the solution? Get motivated. If it's a lack of energy, get energized. If it's a lack of, what was the other thing I said? Motivation, energy, willpower. Is that the same thing with motivation? I don't know, but it's not. According to Saadia Gaon, what is laziness? It's a type of short-sightedness. It's a short-sightedness and an intolerance of immediate pain. So you just try to get out of whatever's causing you immediate pain. It's like, do your homework. That's causing me conflict. I don't want to do it. That's laziness. This is why I was in my Jewish ethics class today. I was talking about how the tzaddik will formulate good habits, and habits are really a form of laziness, because when you form a good habit, you don't have to think about stuff, and that lets you get by without without the pain of like making decisions. Anyway, this is a whole side point. Okay, but Atzlus is one fundamental vice. The other, likewise, the instinctual part of man lusts and inclines towards everything which brings him immediate enjoyment and pleasure. This is due to the vice called tava, right? Or taiva, as we say in Ashkenaz land. I feel like taiva is used very loosely. I think, people translate taiva as desire, but you see, it's not just desire. Taiva is the drive for immediate pleasure. Okay, so that's why we tend to not use taiva as a synonym for desire in all cases. We typically associate it with the instinctual. Right. I mean, yeah, Rambam also uses it for Avas Shem. That's a big question why he does that. But we tend to associate it with instinctual or with bad. Okay, so it's immediate desire for immediate pleasure. Okay. Now he starts to transition into why Shlomo wrote, or why we need Mishlei. Therefore, everyone needs the guidance of a chacham, a wise man, who will reveal to him the consequences of that which causes the instincts to rejoice but is harmful in the eyes of the intellect, and the consequences of that which is unpleasant to the instincts and beneficial to the eyes of the intellect. So in other words, we need an intellect for our intellect, okay? Meaning when we first start off, our intellect is not very good at doing its job. So it's not good at looking at the long term. So we need Shlomo, or we need a chacham, not necessarily Shlomo. We need a chacham to guide us in exercising our intellect properly, to look at the long term, until we can internalize that way of thinking on our own. Then he will be able to withstand the immediate pain and strive toward that which will yield a good outcome. As it says, only if there is a lasting outcome. Then he will refrain from that which his desires draw him toward, based upon his recognition of its harmful nature. As it is stated, there is a path which is upright before a man whose end is the paths of death. So this is the type of restraint that Shlomo was talking about earlier. And Saadia Gaon doesn't say this outright here, but this, to my mind, is the best definition of musar, right? Musar is literally discipline or rebuke, so I'm talking about the discipline version. Musar is the intellect holding the person back from acting on impulse, either on atzlus, on avoiding immediate pain, or on tava, of immediate pleasure, for the sake of a better long-term outcome. So it's a specific type of self-governance, a specific type of restraint, and that's the definition of musar. And if there were anything I could do to musar has a certain connotation in this society. Either the people associated with, I think it came from Rav Yisrael Salanter's Musar movement, which I don't know much about, so I can't really speak of it. But somewhere along the line, Musar became associated with the fire and brimstone, with guilt-inducing, with shaming, with maybe making people feel religiously inferior. And people either love it or they're disgusted by it. So I if I could, I would reclaim the term Musar. But for now, I have to use the term, Mishleic Musar or Shlomo HaMelech's Musar, and then I have to explain what that means. So between us, that's what we mean by it. Shlomo HaMelech's Musar is restraining the animalistic part of you from acting impulsively for the sake of long-term pleasure or long-term avoiding of a long-term consequence. Okay, onward. Okay. Due to man's attitude towards this way of life, if he were left alone to choose whether he would follow it, his instincts would likely lead him astray from it. So not only is having the chacham a good idea, but it's practically a necessity, because if we didn't have anyone to guide us, we would all end up as feral children in the woods and just acting like animals. All right, therefore it was necessary for the wise one, may he be exalted and glorified. Now, if you read the Hebrew, it says, Lefika chayav hachacham. And when you think of hachacham, you think of Shlomo. But this is hacham yisromam yishadar. May he be exalted and glorified. So I think he's talking about God. It's just weird calling God the chacham. You know, I don't usually hear that. I mean, not that we doubt that, but like, it's just odd, okay? Therefore, it was necessary for the wise one to establish a book based, oops, that's a typo there, based on the expressions of the chacham, Shlomo ben David. Okay, maybe he's just trying to use parallel phrases here. The true chacham, God, is trying to designate a chacham on earth, Shlomo ben David, in which he reveals the beneficial outcomes of that which the instincts loathe and makes known their praise, their value, and their honor in order that man will strive for them and resist the Atzlus within him, and in which he reveals the harmful consequences of those things towards which man's instinctual nature inclines and exposes their bitterness, their evil, and their harm in order that man will recoil from them and resist the tava within him. So to sum it up, what's the purpose of Mishlei according to Saadia Gaon? What are you going to get out of Mishlei?
A lot of pleasure.
A lot of pleasure, right? You're going to get a lot of, and not only that, he's going to throw in as a bonus, avoidance of long-term pain, okay? So Mishlei is a book for enjoying life, all right? And this is where we get to some radical differences among the Rishonim. Again, you know, Rabbi Zimmer is giving a shiur on Rashi's approach to Mishlei, and according to Rashi, Mishlei is a book about Torah and heresy, okay? The battle between Torah and heresy, far cry from a pleasure guide, right? And so, you know, Saadia Gaon and others, like, you know, Meiri has this approach. I mean, they all have nuanced differences, but you know, Rabbeinu Yonah follows this approach, Meiri follows this approach, Metzudas David follows this approach. There's a whole, you know, there's a lot of overlap and a lot of differences among the Mefarshim and Mishlei, but this is Saadia Gaon's thing. And this is why I think it is the perfect book for any human being to learn, not just Jews and not just religious Jews, because everyone wants pleasure. Who doesn't want pleasure and who doesn't want to avoid pain? And, you know, you show this book to, there's an article I read about a mafioso who was in prison. And I guess like people read a lot of books in prison if they're so inclined. And the Bible is one of the good books. And so this mafioso was saying how he loves Mishlei, because it just shows him how to function, you know, in a more effective manner, you know? So you could give this to a criminal and say, hey, do you want more pleasure? And he'd say, yes, learn Mishlei. You know, you could give this to a politician. Do you want, you know, you want more votes? You want more corruption? Or not corruption. You want more profit to gain from your political position? Mishlei will show you how to do it. So it literally is for everybody. And you don't have to sell someone on it. It's whatever pleasure you're seeking, Mishlei will show you how to get it more intelligently. Now, long term, Shlomo will show you, he might show you that there's certain pleasures that like, you know, that are going to bring you so much pain that they're not worth it. But in principle, he's showing you how to live the most pleasurable life. Did I hear someone ask a question?
No, sorry.
Okay. Side point here. Which this is not a Koheles shiur. Koheles shiur, you know, Koheles is a different thing. But just to briefly comment on how they relate to each other. In Koheles is all, so Mishlei is all about the means. Shlomo and Mishlei is he's not going to pass judgment on you. He's not going to question what you're seeking in life. He's just going to show you how to do it in a way that gets you the most pleasure. Koheles is exactly the opposite. He is not going to show you how to make decisions, but he's going to question all of your hopes and dreams and show you what your life is about and where that's going to lead you, you know? So they complement each other. Koheles is about ends, Mishlei is about means. Okay, and Mishlei is more pleasant because he doesn't question your means. He just lets you, he doesn't question your ends. He just lets you pursue it. He just teaches you more effective means. Okay. So now I promised you earlier that I would show you a coherent explanation of this pasuk, which is stating the primary goal of Mishlei, and that's the way I learned. By the way, that pasuk, this pasuk beis is like that's the main goal of Mishlei, or if really it's Ladas Chacham Musar is the main goal of Mishlei. So the best interpretation I found of the words in the pasuk is from the Radak, and unfortunately the Radak is not really available widely in print, but he is available online. So if you're looking for the Radak, he's there. He's not going to be in your Mikros Gedolos, so don't try to look for this. He says like this: Ladas Chachma. what does this mean? This means to say, Ladas ha'to'elis shetasig la'adam avor ha'chachma, to know the benefit that man attains on account of wisdom, kamosha masaber v'holech, as he continues to tell, meaning in the intro. Umusar ha'onesh, that's the punishment, but he says specific kind of punishment, klomar ha'yisurim, the afflictions, ha'bayim la'adam min ha'sichlos, that come to man from folly. So we're not talking punishments from based in, like the Torah imposed punishments. We're not talking about punishments from God. We're talking about punishments that come from acting stupidly. Shu hafek min ha'chachma, which is the opposite of chachma. And then lahavinim rebina, to understand statements of understanding, klomar hadavarim shiroi la'adam lihizbonim dehem kodem shiyaseosam, the statements that it is proper for a person to contemplate before he implements them, meaning before he carries them out in action. Kadei sheyeda ma yihi acharisim, to know what their outcome will be, v'yivchar hatov v'yimas hara, to choose the good and reject the bad. Again, not in the ultimate morally good and morally bad sense, but in the this is going to bring me benefits and this is going to bring me harm. So that's like a clean interpretation of the first statement of the goals of Mishlei based on what Saadia Gaon said. Okay, any questions about the goals of Mishlei right now? Because we have one more part, which is I'm skipping in Saadia Gaon's introduction. One more part on the agenda for tonight. But any questions on the goals so far? Alrighty, so skipping in Saadia Gaon's introduction, he says this one last point, which I thought was relevant. There's a lot of good stuff in the Hakdama, but I thought this was relevant for our intro here. Furthermore, knowledge based on the five senses is easier and more familiar to the masses than knowledge based on the intellect, because the sensory organs, typo there, sensory organs are with them from birth. Therefore, it is necessary to construct allegories for them in order to equate for them the duties determined by the intellect with the duties of the senses. So the first point here is he's basically saying, your senses come online before your intellect does. And you are living in a world of stimulus response, and conditioning before you can think through abstract decision-making and think about the future, think about things that are not physically present, okay? Or think about consequences that are not temporally happening right now. So for this reason, we are impacted much more by what we see and hear and taste and feel and touch, that's the other one, than what we think about. So he's saying that's why you need mashalim, that's why you need allegories, and he gives examples. Or first of all, he explains. He says, the explanation of the matter is as follows. When the sense of sight sees fire, any living being will flee from it out of fear of being burned. Similarly, if he hears a loud noise, he will flee from it out of an instinctual fear, because these things are sensed by them. And for this reason, when the intellect perceives something destructive or hears something harmful, and it reveals this thing to the instincts and sees that it won't rely on it or accept it from it, it speaks to it in a manner which it understands, saying, pay attention, this thing of which I speak to you is like the fire which you would flee from if you saw it, and like the deep waters in which you would be cautious not to drown in. So in other words, the animalistic part of you only responds to sensory stimuli, or not only, but primarily. And so if the intellect wants to reach the animalistic, it has to compare it to something sensory that it's familiar with. So he gives a bunch of examples. First he says, this is the benefit of allegories, to present to the instincts that which is clear to the intellect, as if to say, this is similar to what your senses experience. And thus the decision was made to name the book of allegories, because, sorry, typo again, I hurriedly typed this out before shiur, not thinking ahead. I should have done this earlier. And thus the decision was made to name this book the Book of Allegories because it contains these types of allegories. It compares theft, whose degradation is apparent to the intellect, to murder, whose degradation is apparent to the instincts. As the pasuk says, such are the ways of all thieves. They take the souls of wealth's owners. So just to elaborate on that mushal there. In the first chapter of Mishlei, he says, if you steal something, so then it's like a bird that wanders into a trap thinking that the bait is free, and then it gets trapped by the hunter, so it loses its life. So it compares stealing, which is a much more abstract harm, to instant death, which is something that is very real to the emotions. It compares prostitution, the corruption of which the intellect is well aware, to falling into a pit, which is a form of demise that is obvious to the senses. As the pasuk says, for the harlot is a deep pit, and the strange woman a narrow well. So again, saying that you shouldn't frequent a harlot because, you're going to get addicted and dependent, and that's going to be to your detriment. That's a very abstract argument the emotions can't hear. But if you say, oh, it's like jumping into a pit with no way out, so that's something that impacts the emotions. It compares a person, again, sorry, typo. Person who cannot rule over his emotions, the sinfulness of which is clear to the intellect, to a city without walls, whose desolateness is obvious to the senses. As the pasuk says, like a breached city without a wall, so is a man with no constraint to his spirit. So, you talk to a person and say, you got to control your emotions and not be impulsive. That's already a high level argument. But if you say, we're going to protect our city with no walls, that's just absurd. And even the emotions can grasp that. So just to summarize what he means here. So on a simple level, he's saying, if you want to affect the emotions, you have to speak to them in their own language. And that's one benefit of allegories. But I think that there's another benefit in the way Shlomo wrote his book here, which is even the psukim that are not allegories, they use real world examples. Excuse me. And telling someone, smoking is harmful takes a certain abstract level of thinking. But when you see somebody who's suffering from, emphysema or who died from lung cancer, that impacts your emotions in a much more real way than just hearing the abstract harm, And that's the other method, that's the other derech mashal that Shlomo uses, is he gives analogies, but he also gives real world examples. And the real world examples are what affect your emotions. And that's why Rabbi Moskowitz always pointed out that whenever you see a book that has a lot of repetition, then it's written primarily to reach the emotions, not the intellect. Because the intellect only needs to see an idea once for it to be clear, but the emotions need to see things in a very particular sense from many different angles before they start to get affected. That's why, if you want to summarize all of Mishlei in one sentence, it would be Chazal's definition of a chacham. Ezeu chacham haro es hanolad. Who's wise? One who sees the consequences of his decisions. But if you say that to someone, that's not going to move them. You need to walk through many, many, many different practical decision-making scenarios and show this is what happens when you neglect your intellect here. This is what happens when you listen to your tithas here. This is what happens when you give into laziness here. And that's what the book of Mishlei is it's tons of examples that illustrate in a way that's real to the emotions what happens when you don't live a life of chachma. Okay? And that's the derech of Mishlei. And that's what the whole middle of the book is. That's why you've got 29 chapters, 19 chapters of just example after example, mushal after mushal, because you just need lots and lots of examples to affect the emotions.
I have a question.
Yes.
What I understand that Rav Saadia Gaon is saying that the senses are somewhat more attainable, and therefore when you use imagery, it's more effective. But I'm not really sure why that is the case. Why can't the emotions just glom onto an idea and accept it?
Yeah. So in what we read, he said it's because they were prior in nature to the intellect, and I think the modern. I mean, I'm not a neurologist, or I don't know the brain, but people speak of the more primal parts of the brain that that someone fill me in on the details, please, if you know what I'm talking about.
Are you talking about like the lizard brain?
The people call it the lizard brain. I don't know where that term comes from. I don't know if it's just like a reptilian thing that but that sounds like the type of argument that he's making that let's say like the part of your brain that regulates the basic needs of thirst and hunger and like your basic instincts, they kind of override everything else, and you can't simply like shortcut them. If they're the parts of your brain, if they're the things that are like yelling and clamoring for action, then they're going to be very loud.
But meaning like mashalim or parables or little stories, those are all like imaginative. Like I'm not actually sensing the falling into the pit in the example of the harlot. So why is it that like the imagination is more accessible to the emotions than say an idea that prostitution is a bad idea? Okay,
so the short encoded answer to that is that the answer is this is a result of the chait of eating from the Eitz Hadas Tov Ra. Okay, that according to the Rambam, according to the Rambam, then our imagination, the role of our imagination changed fundamentally. I mean, if you take that event as an event, so then it changed. but if you take it as a mashal for just how human psyche is set up, so the imagination ideally should be a servant of the intellect to help it in its quest for knowledge, and should also be restrained by the reality of the intellect to not go crazy with fantasies and wild fears. But what happened as a result of the hate, or what happened as a result of human design, so the animalistic instincts hijack the imagination and use it to amplify the prospects of pleasure that it's going to get, or amplify the danger of the harm that it's going to face, and that's something that we have to contend with. Again, part of this is very much tied to Gan Eden and how you understand the Gan Eden story, but it all boils down to that: is that theoretically the intellect can use the imagination, but functionally, practically, we are in a situation where our instincts have been hijacked, or have hijacked it for their own purposes. This is the mashal of the Samael riding the Nachash. That's the code.
Okay, so if I could restate and just correct me if I'm off, it sounds like you're saying the imagination is, strictly speaking, a tool of the mind. It requires abstraction and creating concepts and playing with them in a way that doesn't actually exist, but it is the part of the mind which is most closely tied to the emotion. The emotion makes use of the intellect. So if I use the intellect to convey an idea, if I use the imagination to convey an idea, the emotions will more quickly glom onto it.
Yes, that's a good way to say it. And I think that that added to that is the point he made, which is that the emotions and the intellect were, the emotions and the imagination were a duo for they had a good 13 years together before the intellect burst on the scene and ruined things.
Right.
Yeah. I was going to say one other example. I can't not mention this example from Rabbi Sachs, from Rabbi Yoni Sachs, about the illustrating the relationship between the imagination, the intellect, and the emotions. Is you see, the legend goes that Newton discovered the theory of gravity when the apple fell and hit him on the head, and so the question is a lot of people see apples fall and they didn't think of gravity, right? So what makes Newton any different? So the way Rabbi Sachs, the examples he gives is he says basically, you see an apple fall and one person says, "Ooh, I'm hungry. This is food." The other person sees an apple fall and says, "Ooh, I can collect these and sell them. This is profit." Another person sees the apple fall and says, "Oh, there's Susie over there, my enemy. I can throw this at Susie and hit her. This is a weapon," And another person says, "I have no pleasure I can get out of this. It's nothing." So Isaac Newton, though, sees the apple and says, "This is a body in motion." Okay, so what's the difference? The difference is that the first four people were relating to the apple via their animal instincts and only defining it in terms of the pleasure they could get out of it. And all of the operation of their imagination was taking it and just picturing things they could do with it that would give them pleasure. Isaac Newton was viewing it as a Tselem Elohim and imagining it as a body in motion, and imagining the moon orbiting the Earth, and then using that as a basis for trying to grasp insight into the Chachmas Hashem in the universe. So it's a different orientation towards the physical world and a different use of the imagination, and that's a rarity. We just for us, imagination just serves our animalistic instincts by default. Okay. Any other questions? I think this would be a good place to stop. I mean, I'll stay as long as there are questions. I was going to go through the method of learning Mishlei. I think we'll save that for next time, because that's when we're actually going to start learning Mishlei. So we'll save that for then.
Yeah. Going to ask quickly, this is kind of on the side. I remember Rabbi Moskowitz taught that book of Mishlei from an approach that has it's not really Torah. It's not telling you the reward and punishment of it's not metaphysical. I'm trying to say.
Right.
Is that this approach that we're going to do? And then
I
just wanted to a bit of comment about that.
Yeah, you want me to answer first and then you want to comment, or you want to comment?
just like your thoughts about that, and then
Yeah.
is that going to be our approach also? And
Yeah, so that is going to be our approach. And again, this is I like to use the first example, that example I mentioned about the stealing, right? So if you ask the average Torah observant Jew, why shouldn't you steal? So probably the first answer you're going to get is it's usser, okay? Second answer you're going to get is it's unjust, or like it's not right. Okay, you'll get like a moral argument or a halakhic argument. What's Shlomo HaMelech's first argument for why you shouldn't steal? Because if you steal, you're like a bird taking bait from a trap, and you're just going to get caught. That's a very Mishleic argument. And there is a place for halakhic arguments. That's halacha. There is a place for philosophical arguments. There's a place for justice arguments. That place is not Mishlei according to Saadia Gaon, or at least according to his Hakdama. He's giving you purely self-interested, pleasure, pain-based reasons for keeping Torah. And for this reason, by the way, Mishlei is in certain ways a commentary on Torah. I chose not to deal with that today, but there's a whole genre of midrash, or a whole section of midrashim which talk about the relationship between Mishlei and Torah. It's a supplement, but Mishlei will almost always stay away from mishpatim. From chukim. It will mostly focus on mishpatim because those really are within the realm of pleasure, pain. And when Mishlei does talk about chukim, then it will talk about it from a pleasure, pain perspective.
what's the purpose of that? I mean, not just saying, okay, this is usher because it's against the Torah. It's from God. Is it to make the Torah more acceptable to your emotions?
Yeah, I think that's what it is. It's that we tend to have an animalistic resistance to being told what to do and what not to do. And if you, the animal, are shown that you get pleasure out of it, so then you're going to be much more willing to obey. That's the first step. And then on a higher level, once you're living a life of Torah, your whole value system is going to change, and you'll start to value chachma. For its own sake, you'll start to value justice. You'll start to pursue yiras Hashem and avas Hashem, and then that'll lead you there. But the first step has to be like living a Torah lifestyle, and the best way to do that is to show how it's in the best interest for the animal within us.
It reminds me of like the Kamel V'Kiblu of Megillat Esther. Like I'm not to put you on that level.
Say that one more time. Sorry, I missed it.
It reminds me of the the difference between like when the Jews accepted the Torah Sinai and Megillat Esther.
Yeah, Kimov V'Kiblu, right. Is that they saw as it was in their best interest as opposed to being forced, and there was resistance. Yeah, it's a good connection. Okay, anything else? Alrighty, so just to clarify here the scope of what we're going to do. So I think the next time we meet for Lomdeha on Monday nights is going to be after Sukkot. I am still giving, I'm scheduled to give Mishlei shiurim in yeshiva that are not open to the community right now on Mondays and Tuesday mornings. So even though those are not open to call in, they will go up on my YouTube channel. And so you can start learning Mishlei from that. And we're going to be doing two different chapters. With them in yeshiva, I'm doing chapter 18. And for us, we're going to start with chapter 10. That's going to be the plan. And we'll just go straight through and learn Mishlei until we drop. Okay? Yeah.
I feel like Mishlei wouldn't really endorse that.
Right. Unless you've lived a full life before dropping. Yeah. Yeah. Mishlei would endorse not learning Mishlei all the time. You got to go play also. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, Rob.
Night.
Have a rejuvenating sleep.
Yes. Thank you. You too.